Corydon by André Gide. Fourth dialogue. A book appeared recently, he said, which created a certain amount of scandal, and I have to admit that I myself could not avoid feeling a shock of disapproval as I read it. Perhaps you know it. Corydon then handed me the tract on Marriage by Léon Blum. It amuses me, I said, to hear you in your turn speak of disapproval. Yes, I have read the book. I think it is clever, and for that reason rather dangerous. The Jews are past masters in the art of debunking our most cherished institutions, those, in fact, which constitute the very pillars and foundations of Western civilization, in favor of I know not what license and laxity of morals, which fortunately are repugnant to our good sense and our Latin instinct for proper social values. I have always thought that this was perhaps the most characteristic trait of their literature and of their theatre in particular. People have protested against this book, he went on, but no one has refuted it. Protests are quite enough. But the problem still remains, and to dodge it is not to solve it, however indignant one feels at the solution offered by Blum. What problem? It is directly connected with what I was saying the day before yesterday. The male has far more expendable sexual energy than is actually required to meet the demands of the reproductive function of the opposite sex and to ensure the reproduction of the species. The sexual activity prompted by nature is difficult to regulate and runs the risk of prejudicing the good order of society, such as is understood by Western peoples. Hence the nostalgia for the harem in Blum's book, which, as I have said, is repugnant to our moral sense and our Western institutions, which are essentially monogamous. We prefer brothels. Oh, shut up. Then let's say prostitution or adultery. There is no getting away from it. Unless one argues, as the great Malthus did, that chastity is not, as some people suppose, an enforced virtue. It is founded on nature and reason. In fact, this virtue is the only legitimate way of avoiding the vices and misery which the law of population engenders. Evidently, therefore, chastity is a virtue, which it is best not to try and control too much by legislation, don't you think? In my book, I would prefer not to have recourse to virtue except as a last resort. Léon Blum, who makes no appeal to virtue, but who seeks a solution that will cause the minimum of social inconvenience, is indignant at the state of affairs where the licensed prostitute is degraded, with the connivance of the law. I think that we can sympathize with him here. Leaving out of account the danger to public health, which occurs as soon as prostitution escapes the disgusting supervision of the state. That is why Blum proposes that our restless, excessive sexual energy should be directed to young women, and by that I mean honest young women, who will soon be wives and mothers. Yes, I remember that struck me as being particularly monstrous, and made me doubt whether he had ever moved in real French society, or only amongst Levantines. I can certainly imagine more than one Catholic hesitating to marry a girl who had received her initiation from a Jew. But if you object to every solution offered, then tell me yours. I already have an unpleasant presentiment of what it is. I did not invent it. It is the same one that was approved in Greece. Oh my God, here we are. Please listen to me calmly. I cannot help hoping that people with the same background and education must be able to understand each other's point of view to some extent, in spite of differences in temperament. From earliest childhood you have been educated as I have. You have been taught to venerate Greece, to which we are the heirs. In our schools and our museums, Greek works occupy the places of honor. We are asked to recognize them for what they are, human miracles of harmony, proportion, balance, and wisdom. They are held up to us as examples, besides which we are taught that the work of art is never an accidental phenomenon, and that we must look for its explanation and motive in the people themselves and in the artist who produces it, the artist who is only giving expression to the harmony that has first been realized within himself. We know all that. Go on. We know also that it was not only in the plastic arts that Greece excelled, but that this same perfection, this wonderful gift for harmony, are found in all other manifestations of its life. A Sophocles, a Pindar, an Aristophanes, a Socrates, a Milesiades, a Themistocles, or a Plato are representatives of Greece no less to be admired than a Lysippus or a Phidias. This equilibrium, which we admire in each artist and in each work of art, belongs to Greece in its entirety, a beautiful plant without blemish, the full development of each branch doing nothing to hinder the development of any other. All this has been agreed on long ago, but it has nothing to do with what? Do you refuse to recognize any direct connection between the flower and the plant that bears it, between the essential quality of its sap and its behavior and formation? Will you try and persuade me that a people which was capable of offering the world such a picture of wisdom, strength, grace, and happiness did not know how to conduct its own affairs, did not know, first of all, how to apply this wisdom and harmony to its own life and to the ordering of its morals? Yet as soon as Greek morals are mentioned, they are deplored, and since they cannot be ignored, they are turned from in horror. One does not understand, or one pretends not to understand. No one wants to admit that they form an integral part of the whole, that they are indispensable to the working of the social organism, and that, without them, the beautiful flower that one admires would be different, or would not exist at all. If, leaving aside general considerations, we examine one particular case, that of Epaminondas, for example, whom Cicero considered the greatest man produced by Greece, and one cannot deny, wrote one of his biographers, Vulcanaire, that he offers one of the most perfect examples of the great leader, patriot, and sage, then this same biographer finds it necessary to add, unfortunately it seems all too certain that Epaminondas was addicted to that infamous taste which the Greeks, and particularly the Boeotians and Lacedaemonians, that is to say, the most courageous, did not consider shameful. Biographie universelle. You must admit, however, that this type of morality occupies only a small place in Greek literature. Yes, in the part that has survived, maybe. But you must also remember that whenever Plutarch and Plato speak of love, they are referring to homosexual love as much as to the other. Then again, you have to consider the fact, and even if the observation has been made before, I do not think much importance has been attached to it, that almost all the ancient manuscripts from which our knowledge of Greece is derived have passed through the hands of the Church. It would be interesting to make a study of the history of ancient manuscripts. One might discover, perhaps, whether the monastic scholars who transcribed the texts for us did not on occasions suppress the passages which shocked them, out of respect for their cause, or at any rate preferred to select those passages which shocked them least. Think of the number of plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles. Out of 90 plays by the one, and 120 by the other, we are acquainted with only 7. But we do know that the Myrmidons of Aeschylus, for example, spoke of Achilles' love for Patroclus, and even the few verses quoted by Plutarch are sufficient to indicate the nature of their relationship. But let us go on. I am quite willing to believe that homosexual love occupied no greater place in Greek tragedy than in Marlowe's plays, for example, which in itself would be conclusive enough. What would this prove except that drama is to be found elsewhere? Or to express myself more clearly, that the material of tragedy is not to be found in this happy form of love, whereas one comes across it constantly in lyric poetry, the mythological stories, and in all the biographies and treatises, despite the fact that almost all of them have passed through the same process of expurgation. I don't know what answer to give you. I am not sufficiently well informed. Anyway, this is not the point which principally concerns me, for after all, what is a Hylas, a Bathyllus, or a Ganymede, compared with the wonderful figures of Andromache, Iphigenia, Alcestis, Antigone presented to us in the tragedies? I claim that we also owe this pure conception of womanhood to homosexuality, and I do not think I am going too far when I say that the same is true of Shakespeare. If that is not a paradox, then I would like to know— you will quickly appreciate my point if you will consider the fact that, given our moral outlook, no other literature has devoted more attention to adultery than the French, not to speak of all the semi-virgins and all the semi-prostitutes. The Greeks advocated an outlet which seemed natural to them, but which fills you with such indignation that you wish to suppress it, in which case you must make men into saints, for otherwise physical desire will cause them to misuse their wives or defile young women. The Greek girl was brought up with a view to maternity rather than love. Men's desires, as we have seen, were directed elsewhere, for nothing seemed more essential to the state, or worthy of greater respect, than the undefiled peace of the woman's home. So according to you, it is to save the woman that the boy is sacrificed. We will consider in a minute whether any sacrifice was involved. But before that, I would like to answer a specious objection that has been bothering me. Pierre Louis reproaches Sparta for not having been able to produce any artists, and he finds occasion in this to protest against a too austere form of virtue that was only able, he says, to produce warriors, and one that finally allowed themselves to be beaten. The glory and grandeur of Sparta do not amount to much, for anyone who is not a blind admirer of antiquity, wrote de la Boulaye in a note on Montesquieu. Did anything emerge from this military monastery except ruin and destruction? What does civilization owe to these barbarians? Yes, I remember this criticism. Others have made it too, but I am not sure whether it is just. Anyway, the facts are there. In the first place, you must not forget that it is to Sparta that we owe the Doric order of Paestum and the Parthenon. And again, you must remember that had the blind Homer been born in Sparta, he would have been cast into a dungeon. It is there, in the dungeons, that I imagine one must look for the artists of Lacedaemonia. Perhaps Sparta was not incapable of producing them, but since its only consideration was physical perfection, and since bodily infirmity is often the price of genius. Yes, I see what you mean. Sparta systematically destroyed all its children who were, like Victor Hugo, born cold, colorless, and voiceless. But on the other hand, it did permit Sparta to develop the most perfect physical specimens. Sparta invented selection. It is true it produced no sculptors, but it provided the model for sculptors. Listening to you, one would think that all the models of Athens came from Lacedaemonia, just as today the models of Rome come from Sarajevo. That is absurd. I suppose you would have me believe that all men in Greece with fine physiques were half-wits, while all the artists were bandy-legged or knock-kneed. Remember that Sophocles, as a young man at Salamis. Corydon smiled and showed with a gesture that he granted me this point. Then he continued, "One further remark on the subject of the Spartans. You must not overlook the fact that in Lacedaemonia, homosexuality was not only admitted, but, if I dare say so, was even approved. Alternatively, you must not overlook the fact that the Spartans were an eminently warlike race. The Spartans, we read in Plutarch, were the finest performers and the most skillful instructors in everything connected with the art of war. In the same way, you must not ignore the fact that the Thebans— Just a minute, I said, interrupting him. Today I have brought my own texts. And I drew from my pocket a notebook in which the previous evening I had copied this passage from The Spirit of Laws, Volume 4, Chapter 8, which I proceeded to read to him. We blush to read in Plutarch how the Thebans, in order to soften the habits of their young men, established by law that kind of love which should be prohibited in all nations of the world. Yes, that is exactly what I was telling you, he replied. Today there is no one who does not condemn it. And I know it is folly to try, as an isolated individual, to be wise, but since you drive me to it, let's reread in full the passage from Plutarch which made Montesquieu so indignant. He fetched an old and heavy volume, opened it at the life of Pelopidas, and read, "In all the battles fought by the Lacedaemonians, either against the Greeks or against the barbarians, no one ever remembered their being defeated by an enemy inferior in numbers, or even equal in numbers, as had just occurred at Tegea, the battle which Plutarch has been describing. This battle was the first to teach the Greeks that brave and warlike men could be bred, not only on the banks of the Eurotas, but anywhere where young men shunned disgrace, proved their courage by valiant deeds, and preferred death to dishonor. Here, also, men were found to be formidable opponents for their enemies. Well, I did not make him say it. Anywhere where young men shunned disgrace and preferred death to dishonor." "I am afraid you have misunderstood," Corydon answered gravely. "The inference one must draw from this passage is, on the contrary, that homosexuality was not considered at all reprehensible. This is borne out by all that follows." He continued reading. "The sacred band of Thebans was organized, it is said, by Gorgidas, and was composed of 300 chosen men. The state provided for the expenses of their training and maintenance. There are some who claim that this battalion was composed of lovers, and they quote in this connection the words of Pamenis. The lovers must be ranged close to one another, for to break and scatter a battalion, formed of men who loved each other, would be impossible, because those who composed it would face all dangers, some through attachment to the persons they loved, and others through fear of disgracing themselves in the eyes of their lovers. That will make you realize," said Corydon, "what the idea of dishonor meant to them. In this there is nothing astonishing." Plutarch continues wisely, If it be true that men are more afraid of those who love them, even when absent, than they are of all others present, tell me if that is not admirable. Obviously, I retorted, but it is equally true when there is no question of immoral relationships. And so, one of these warriors, he continued, reading, struck down, and, seeing himself on the point of death, begs and implores his enemy to plunge the sword through his breast, so that at least my lover, he says, shall not suffer the same, on finding my body of seeing I was struck from behind. It is also related how Aeolus, loved by Hercules, shared his labors and fought by his side. But no doubt you prefer to imagine Hercules with Omphale or Dejanira. Aristotle records how pairs of lovers, even in his day, would go to the tomb of Aeolus to make their vows. So it is reasonable to suppose that this battalion was named the Sacred Band for the same reason that prompted Plato to define a lover as a friend in whom one felt something divine. The Sacred Band of Thebans remained invincible till the Battle of Chaeronea. When touring the scene of carnage after the battle, Philip halted at the spot where the 300 lay. It was a tangled heap of bodies and weapons, and each man had his breast pierced with a sword thrust. In surprise, he contemplated this spectacle, and learning that it was the battalion of lovers, he wept for them and cried, "Let any man perish miserably who dare suggest that these men were capable of committing or enduring anything dishonorable." "You can say what you like," I exclaimed, "but you will never succeed in making me think of these heroes as debauchees." "Who is trying to say that they were? Why are you so reluctant to admit that this form of love, like any other, may be capable of self-denial, self-sacrifice, and sometimes even chastity? The remainder of Plutarch's writing clearly shows that although it often entailed chastity, that nevertheless was not one of its pretenses. In support of this, you know that I could quote many examples from the texts, not only from Plutarch, and that collected together they would constitute an entire book. Would you like them? They are at your disposal. I can think of no opinion more false and yet more widely held than that which considers homosexuality the unfortunate lot of effeminate races and decadent peoples, and even sees it as an importation from Asia. On the contrary, it was from Asia that the softened Ionic order came to supplant the masculine architecture of the Doric style. The decadence of Athens commenced when the Greeks ceased to frequent the gymnasium, and we now know what should be understood by that. Homosexuality gave way to heterosexuality, and it is then that we see it acquire equal ascendancy in the works of Euripides, together with its natural corollary, misogyny. Why suddenly misogyny? What would you expect? It is a fact, and a very important fact, the converse of what I was pointing out just now. What was that? That we owe our respect for women to homosexuality. Hence the wonderful pictures of women and girls in the plays of Sophocles and Shakespeare. And just as respect for women usually accompanies homosexuality, so we find that women are less highly honored as soon as they are more generally desired. You must see that that is natural. You must also recognize the fact that homosexual periods, if I dare use the expression, are in no way periods of decadence. On the contrary, I do not think it would be inaccurate to say that the great periods when art flourished, the Greeks at the time of Pericles, the Romans in the century of Augustus, the English at the time of Shakespeare, the Italians at the time of the Renaissance, the French during the Renaissance and again under Louis XIII, the Persians at the time of Hafiz, etc., were the very times when homosexuality expressed itself most openly, and I would even say officially. I would almost go so far as to say that periods and countries without homosexuality are periods and countries without art. Don't you think that this may be an illusion, and that perhaps these periods appear particularly homosexual to you simply because their peculiar brilliance invites us to study them more closely, and because the works to which they owe their fame reveal more clearly and more indiscreetly the passions which inspired them? At last you are admitting what I first said to you, that homosexuality is widely prevalent. Well, I see your ideas have made some progress, said Corydon, smiling. Moreover, I have never claimed that there was a recrudescence of homosexuality at these times, but only a more open admission and freer expression of it. Perhaps, however, he added, after a moment, we do have to believe in some recrudescence during periods of war. Yes, I believe that periods of martial exultation are essentially homosexual periods, in the same way that belligerent peoples are particularly inclined to homosexuality. He hesitated an instant, and then asked abruptly, "Have you ever asked yourself why the Napoleonic Code contains no law aimed at suppressing homosexuality?" "Perhaps," I replied, rather disconcerted, "it is because Napoleon attached no importance to it, or because he reckoned that our instinctive repugnance would be sufficient. Perhaps it is also because such laws would have embarrassed some of his best generals. Reprehensible or not, these habits are so far from being softening and so close to being military that I have to admit I trembled for us at the time of those sensational trials in Germany, which even the Kaiser's vigilance could not succeed in suppressing, and even earlier at the time of Krupp's suicide. Some people in France were naive enough to see these as signs of decadence, while I was quietly thinking to myself, we should beware of a people whose debauchery even is warlike, and which keeps its women for the purpose of providing beautiful children. Allow me to suggest that, faced as we are with a disturbing decrease in the birth rate of France, this is hardly the moment to encourage, even if one could, the tendencies you advocate. Your theory is, to say the least of it, inopportune. The repopulation— What? You really believe that all those inducements to love will result in the birth of more children? You believe that all these women, with love in mind, will consent to be used just for childbearing? You are joking. I say that the shameless stimulation caused by pictures, theaters, music halls, and many magazines only serves to deter women from their duties and make them perpetual mistresses, who no longer consent willingly to motherhood. I say this, in its own way, is as dangerous to the state as the other form of indulgence, even when practiced to excess, and that the latter entails less waste and fewer excesses. Don't you think you are allowing your special interest in the case to carry you away? And what if I am? The important thing is not to know whether I have an interest in defending this cause, but whether it is worth defending. So that, not content with tolerating homosexuality, you now claim to make a civic virtue of it. Don't try and make me say absurd things. Whether lust is homo or heterosexual, virtue consists in dominating it. I shall come to this in a moment. But without going so far as to claim, as Lycurgus does, at least according to Plutarch, that no citizen can be really honest or useful to the Republic unless he has a friend, I do nevertheless maintain that homosexuality in itself is not in the least harmful to the good order of society or of the state. Quite the contrary. Will you deny, then, that homosexuality is often accompanied by certain intellectual defects which more than one of your colleagues have pointed out? I am referring to doctors. If you don't mind, we will leave aside the inverts. The trouble is that ill-informed people confuse them with normal homosexuals. I hope you understand what I mean by inverts. In any case, degenerates and sick and obsessed people are to be found amongst heterosexuals as well. But alas, I am forced to admit that all too often amongst the others, amongst those you have the face to call normal homosexuals, yes, one can sometimes notice certain defects of character for which I hold public opinion entirely responsible. For the same thing will always occur when a natural instinct is systematically persecuted. Yes, it is public opinion which tends to make homosexuality a breeding ground for hypocrisy, malice, and disrespect for law. Why not have the courage to say, for crime? Obviously, if you make the thing itself a crime, that is exactly what I blame convention for. Just as I hold the public censure of unmarried mothers responsible for 3/4 of the abortions. I grant you that, more generally speaking, these excellent conventions may be held partially responsible for a fall in the birth rate. You know what Balzac called these conventions, the hypocrisy of nations. It is really staggering to see how, on questions so serious, urgent, and vital for the country, people prefer the word to the thing, the shadow to the substance, and how easily they sacrifice the entire stock and capital for the sake of the window dressing. What are you getting at now? Oh, I am not thinking of homosexuality any longer, but of the depopulation of France. But that is leading us too far astray. To get back to the subject, you simply must face the fact that in society, amongst those you meet and visit most frequently, there are numbers of people for whom you have the greatest respect who are as homosexual as Epaminondas or myself. Don't expect me to name them. They all have the best reasons in the world for concealing the fact. And if you should suspect one of them of it, then you prefer to pretend not to notice, and so join in the game of hypocrisy. The exaggerated disapproval which you profess for it only serves to protect the offender, as will always occur in the case of excessive sanctions, of which Montesquieu said, Inhuman cruelty in laws defeats its own purpose. When the penalty is beyond all reason, one is often obliged to grant impunity. Well then, what have you to complain about? About the hypocrisy, the lies, the misrepresentation, and the secretive behavior of a smuggler that you drive the homosexual to adopt. Then you would like to revert to the conventions of Greece? Oh, for God's sake, and for the good of the state. But Christianity has risen above that, thank God, cleansing and sublimating it all, strengthening the family bonds, consecrating marriage, and over and above that, extolling chastity. I would like to hear you answer to that. Either you have not attended properly to what I have said, or you would have realized that my ideas contain nothing damaging to marriage or chastity. I can repeat the words of Malthus. I would be distressed to say anything at all, directly or indirectly, that could be interpreted in a sense contrary to virtue. I am not comparing homosexuality with chastity, but one strong desire, whether satisfied or not, with another, and I maintain that the peace of the home, the honor of the woman, the dignity of the family, and the health of man and wife were more effectively safeguarded by the Greek way of life than by our own, while at the same time chastity and virtue were more nobly taught and more naturally attained. Do you think it was harder for St. Augustine to aspire to God, for first having given his heart to a friend, whom he loved as much as he ever loved woman? Do you really consider that the children of antiquity were more prone to dissipation as the result of their homosexual upbringing than our schoolchildren today with their heterosexual education? I think that a friend, even in the fullest Greek sense of the word, is a better influence on an adolescent than a mistress. I believe that the education in the art of love, which a woman like Madame de Warens, for example, was able to give to the young Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was in certain respects more harmful to him than any Spartan or Theban education would have been. Yes, I believe that Rousseau would have been less neurotic and, as regards women, more virile if he had followed rather more closely the example of those heroes of Plutarch, whom he admired so much. Again, I am not comparing chastity with dissipation of any kind whatsoever, but one form of impurity with another. And I doubt whether young men could reach marriage more spoiled than certain young heterosexuals of today. I say that if a young man falls in love with a girl, and if that love is profound, then there is a good chance of it remaining chaste and not being crossed at once by desire. This is exactly what Victor Hugo understood so clearly when, in Les Miserables, he convinces us that Marius would rather have gone with a prostitute than so much as entertain an impure thought for Cosette. And similarly, Fielding, in Tom Jones, makes his hero tumble the innkeeper's daughters all the better the more he is in love with Sophia. And it is this that Merteuil expresses so well in de la Close's book when the young Dancinus falls in love with the young Volanges. But I add that in view of marriage it would have been better and less risky for each of them had their provisional pleasures been of a different kind. Finally, if you will allow me to compare one form of love with the other, I say that the passionate attachment of an older person or of a friend of the same age is as often capable of self-denial as any feminine attachment. There are many examples of this, and illustrious ones. But here, like Bazalgette in his translation of Whitman, you deliberately replace the word love, which both text and reality suggest, by the non-compromising word friendship. I say that this love, if it is profound, tends towards chastity. But only, it goes without saying, if physical desire is reabsorbed into it, which simple friendship can never achieve, and that, for the boy, it can be the greatest incentive to courage, work, and virtue. I say, too, that an older person is better able to take account of the troubles of an adolescent than any woman, even one expert in the art of love. Indeed, I know certain boys too much addicted to solitary pleasures for whom I consider an attachment of this kind would be the surest remedy. I have seen someone who wanted to be a girl, and a beautiful girl, from the age of 13 till the age of 22, and after that to become a man, said La Bruyère, Des Femmes, Section 3, setting rather high, in my opinion, the age at which the boy's heterosexual instincts become orientated. Until then, his physical desires are indefinite, and he remains at the mercy of outside influences and stimuli. He loves at random. He is ignorant, and until the age of about 18 he invites love, rather than knowing himself how to make love. If, while he is still this moliter juvenis, as Pliny says, more attractive than attracted, some older person is to fall in love with him, then I believe it is best for him that this person should be a friend of his own sex. a belief shared by that civilization which we studied 2 days ago, and which you refuse to admire except for its shell. I think that this friend will jealously watch and guard him, and himself exalted by this love will lead him to those marvelous heights which can never be reached without love. If, alternatively, he falls into the hands of a woman, it can be disastrous for him. One has, alas, all too many examples of that. But since at this tender age he would still not know how to make love in any but the most indifferent manner, it is fortunately not natural for a woman to fall in love with him. For the Greeks, from 13 to 22, to take the years given by La Bruyère, was the age of devoted friendship, high aspiration, and the proudest emulation. Only after that does the boy, in accordance with his own wishes, want to become a man, that is to say, think of women and marriage. I had let him discourse to his heart's content, and had taken care not to interrupt him. When he had finished, he waited a time for some protestation from me. But without saying a word except "Goodbye," I took my hat and left, convinced that in certain circumstances silence was the best reply.